This story is about a world that existed long before the first dinosaur took its first step, about a time when the planet's atmosphere itself was different, and living matter conducted experiments on itself that nature will never repeat. This is the tale of a dynasty of Earth's masters, whose names are almost forgotten today, though their reign lasted longer than the entire history of vertebrates we are used to considering the main heroes of deep time. What is at stake here is not a feat or a battle, but the very possibility of life in its boldest and most demanding form. The creatures I will tell you about were not merely larger than today's. They were built on fundamentally different principles. A 2-meter millipede impossible to imagine beside a human, a dragonfly with the wingspan of an eagle, a marine hunter nearly 3 meters long for whom the first fishes were small change. Armored lords of the seafloor whose eyes gathered thousands of facets into a single panorama of the ancient ocean. All of this lived on a single planet, the same one that carries us today, and all of it vanished. Not in one battle, not from a single blow. They were killed by slow shifts in the composition of the air, by retreating swamps, by a new and harsher era for which their enormous bodies proved too costly. And with them ended an epoch that has no equal before or after it in the scale of its living experiment. The very question was posed, where is the limit of physical form that the living can sustain? And now a question for you. If nature once created giants capable of ruling the world for 300 million years, what is to stop it from doing so again once we are gone? And what would you prefer to see if you had a choice? The ancient nightmare that has passed, or the future that is yet to come? Listen, this story is about how once the Earth did not belong to us. In your mind, transport yourself back 1,200 million years to where not a single familiar feature remains. Forget the rustle of leaves and the song of birds. This world lived by entirely different laws, and the air in it was so dense and heavy it seemed almost tangible. Before you stretches the Carboniferous period, a time of the boldest and most frightening experiments nature has ever conducted on living matter. In the shadow of giant club mosses, whose crowns vanished into low gray clouds, lurked beings whose mere mention chills modern blood in its veins. Picture a millipede more than 2 meters long, not a creature of nightmare nor an invention of Hollywood scriptwriters, but a being of flesh and chitin whose carapace shimmered steadily in the dim rays of an ancient sun. This is Arthropleura, the absolute titan among arthropods, looking at which one feels sincere relief that we are separated from this world by insurmountable abysses of time. The Earth of that time would be utterly unrecognizable were we to look at it from orbit. No Europe, no Asia, no Americas, not a single familiar outline of coastline. All the planet's land was drawn together into a colossal monolith, the supercontinent Pangea, stretching from pole to pole. From the west and east, its shores were washed by the silent fury of Panthalassic, the greatest ocean in the planet's history, which covered more than half of its surface and held back this continental crag from all sides. Only in the east did the waters of Tethys and Paleotethys wash Pangea's shores, seas whose depths today are almost entirely swallowed by the Earth's interior. Only rare patches of the modern Pacific seafloor still preserve in their structure the faintest echo of those epochs when they were part of Panthalassic's undivided dominion. Pangea's climate was harsh and full of contradictions. In the depths of this endless continent reigned drought and piercing cold, a sharply continental climate that turned vast expanses into inland, stony wastelands, where icy, snowless winters gave way to exhausting summer heat. But where the land touched the warm waters of the oceans, and along the equatorial belt, nature knew no limits. Here stretched endless humid forests, soaked through with moisture, a world of tree ferns, giant horsetails, and club mosses, whose forms today seem to us caricatured and deeply alien. It was here, in these damp cradles of life, that history was being made whose consequences we feel to this day. The name Carboniferous, or carbon-bearing, was given to this period for a reason. We are accustomed to thinking of coal as an ordinary mineral resource, but in truth it is a monument to a global biological failure. Around 3 million years ago, nature encountered a problem for which it had no solution. Plants had mastered the synthesis of lignin, an incredibly durable polymer forming the basis of woody trunks. Yet the bacteria and fungi of that time had not yet developed mechanisms to break it down. When colossal trees fell from age or storms, they did not rot as they do now. They lay on top of one another, forming impassable barriers that over time sank into swamp and were preserved there without access to oxygen. Billions of tons of carbon were sealed into the Earth's crust, and this process triggered a tectonic shift in the composition of the atmosphere itself. Since carbon no longer returned into the cycle, the level of carbon dioxide steadily fell, while the concentration of free oxygen rose sharply. This rise was not smooth. The oxygen curve in the Carboniferous resembles a cardiogram in the moment of agony. Sharp jumps from 0.0% to an incredible 31%. Today we breathe air with only 21% oxygen, and the atmosphere of the Carboniferous would be pure poison to us, causing instant oxidation of tissues. But for the inhabitants of that time, this oversaturated air became the most powerful fuel for an evolutionary explosion, the driving force of a gigantism with no analog before or after. The oxygen-saturated air awaited its first conqueror, and she who first took advantage of it was already unfurling her wings over the banks of the Carboniferous rivers. Meganeura, a giant dragonfly with the wingspan of an eagle, on whose powerful legs sat sharp spines that turned her limbs into a deadly catching net, patrolled the shores of rivers and lakes, gliding on rising currents of warm air. This predator was the embodiment of fury and speed. She snatched in flight not only other insects, but also the first timid vertebrates that were only beginning to test the dry land. Studies show that at such a size, she inevitably faced the problem of overheating. Her metabolism was so intense that it required constant cooling, and her flight, in all likelihood, consisted of short but lightning-fast bursts. There is a hypothesis that her respiratory system worked by the principle of forced air injection. Only thus could the work of those giant muscles be sustained in that dense, energy-saturated sky. But if Meganeura was the queen of the skies, then below, in the shaded thickets of the coastal zone, Arthropleura reigned unchallenged. This creature, weighing up to 7 kilograms, would have evoked in any modern observer a primal terror. Her segmented body, shielded by heavy chitinous armor, methodically worked through dozens of pairs of powerful legs, leaving deep furrows in the damp soil. The width of this monster reached dizzied centimeters. It was a living, armored train, carving its way through the fern wastes. Despite her terrifying appearance, Arthropleura concealed an unexpected mystery. Analysis of her jaw apparatus reveals the absence of well-developed mandibles and venom glands characteristic of modern predatory centipedes. Most likely, this 2-meter giant was a peaceful consumer of plant matter, a humble gardener of her age, who slowly and majestically ground fallen leaves and rotting trunks into the foundation of new life. Perhaps at times she did not disdain carrion, serving as the sanitarian of this damp, oxygen-saturated world. And yet even such a titan had hours of absolute vulnerability. The most critical period in the life of Arthropleura was molting. To grow, she had to shed her old armor. And in those hours and days, the 2-meter giant turned into a helpless mass of soft flesh. Without a rigid exoskeleton, her own muscles could not hold up her heavy body on land, and under the force of gravity, she risked simply suffocating. Probably, during molting, Arthropleura went into the water or sought shelter in the rotting trunks of giant club mosses, digging deep burrows into the soft substrate. There, in silence and darkness, they waited until the new armor hardened, and they once again became the invulnerable masters of the undergrowth. The Carboniferous was a time when life tested the limits of physiology, and the age of gigantism became possible because of a unique combination of the atmosphere's chemical imbalance and the complete absence of competition from large vertebrates. Insects and millipedes ruled the planet, creating ecosystems that will never again be repeated in the history of the Earth. The Carboniferous offered its children ideal conditions, endless reserves of food, and a complete absence of serious rivals. Vertebrates were still taking their first uncertain steps on land. They were too small and weak to challenge the many-legged titans. But every golden age sooner or later comes to an end. When the Permian period arrived, the sky over the planet began to change. The humid, enveloping coziness of the tropics gave way to the harsh breath of drought. The near equatorial lands began to turn into lifeless deserts, and the great forests began to retreat. Arthropleura disappeared along with them, not as the losers of a battle, but simply as those who could not fit into the new, harsh, dry world, leaving as quietly as once they had appeared. Meganeura shared their fate. That enormous Carboniferous sky for which she was made collapsed forever. They were killed not by war, not by a predator. They were killed by the silence of drying swamps. The land emptied. But the true cradle of life still lay in the water, and there dwelt beings beside whom Arthropleura would have looked modest. Turning our gaze to the winding shores of the ancient supercontinent, we see boundless shallows bathed in blinding sunlight, a true paradise where abundance of nutrients gave rise to forms of life surpassing any fantasy. It was here, in the depths of coastal waters and at the mouths of rivers, that sea scorpions ruled, creatures whose name sounds like a verdict, but whose history is even more mysterious. Contrary to a widespread misconception, these monsters were not the ancestors of modern scorpions or crayfish. They represented a dead-end yet brilliant branch of evolution that reached its apogee precisely in the Carboniferous. If nature ever created a perfect aquatic predator out of chitin and claws, it was Jaekelopterus. Imagine a creature nearly 3 meters long, a true leviathan of the shallows, the largest arthropod ever to traverse our planet. His single but crushing weapon was the massive claw chelicerae studded with sharp spines, an active and agile hunter for whom fish and other arthropods were only easy prey. However, Jaekelopterus had a strange relative, Hibbertopterus, and if the first was a lightning bolt, the second was a living mountain. At about 2 meters in length, he astonished with incredible width, more than 70 centimeters of armored flesh. Hibbertopterus did not chase prey. He slowly and methodically combed the bottom, like a living combine, gathering the small inhabitants of the silt with his specialized front limbs. His grasping organs were too weak for a struggle, but his defense was absolute. The most astonishing thing about this heavyweight is that he sometimes left his native element. Paleontologists find in fossilized silt deep furrows, traces of a heavy body that dragged across the ground. Why he went onto the shore, to move into a neighboring body of water, or to escape the drying out of the old one, remains to this day one of the greatest mysteries. How did he breathe on land? Perhaps his gills retained moisture long enough, and perhaps he possessed a dual breathing system, a kind of primal amphibian among arthropods. We find only their shed shells, empty husks of former greatness, keeping silent about how the heart beat inside these titans. And above the water's edge in this time rustled forests, unlike anything that exists now. A world without a single flower, a world of eternal green twilight. Here there was no buzzing of bees, no song of birds, only the sound of wind in the crowns of giant club mosses and horsetails. Lepidodendrons soared upward to soar meters, propping up the heavy sky of the Carboniferous with their column-like trunks. Their bark, covered with diamond-shaped scars from fallen leaves, resembled the scales of giant serpents. These trees lived fast and died in masses, without deep roots, but with an incredible will to grow. Beside them in the marshy lowlands rose sigillarias, straight as arrows, reaching 25 meters in height. Their wood was soft and porous, but the bark, hard as stone, and not yielding to decay in the stagnant waters of the swamps. It was precisely this bark, lying in peat layers for hundreds of millions of years, that turned into the very coal that today fuels our civilization. Each time we burn coal to heat a home or run a turbine, we are literally burning the flesh of these ancient forests, the very ones over which once silently and majestically glided the shadows of Meganeura and Arthropleura. But if we leave these humid forests and transport ourselves across the boundless ocean of Panthalassic to where waves break against unseen underwater ridges, we meet those who saw the beginning of time. Trilobites were veterans of the planet even before the first millipede crawled onto the shore. They existed for hundreds of millions of years, adapting to any changes, and in the seas of the Carboniferous reached their final greatness. Among them were their own kings, Isotellus rex, 70-centimeter lords of the seafloor, clad in perfect, segmented armor. Individual fragments of carapaces hint to us that there existed specimens almost a meter long, true armored shields gliding through the darkness of the ocean. Trilobites bore witness to Pleiozoic million years of change, how mountains rose and fell, how climates shifted, how life tried itself in new and sometimes terrifying forms. For 250 million years, they were the living symbol of the ocean, a link between an unimaginably ancient past and the world we know now. Despite the colossal diversity of species, nature held to a single, flawless blueprint for the trilobites. A flattened body divided into clear segments, clad in a powerful exoskeleton, true knightly armor of its time. The head, hidden beneath a massive chitinous shield, was the command center with developed sensory organs. Most of them preferred the stealth of the benthic world, working their many small legs across silt and sand. But there were also those who dared to conquer the water column or to bury themselves deep into the oceanic shelf. Thousands of tiny facets created a panoramic picture of the ancient ocean. Today, only rare deep-sea creatures preserve a faint likeness of this mineral optics, but their eyes are only a pale shadow of the optical perfection that trilobites possessed. In a world where each sought its own niche, the trilobites showed astonishing flexibility. Some peacefully strained the silt, others hunted plankton, and still others themselves became predators, despite the absence of powerful jaws. In a moment of danger, they curled into an impenetrable ball, hiding their vulnerable underside behind chitinous plates. An ideal strategy for survival, but even it did not guarantee safety. In the shadow of underwater cliffs lurked the one whose name became a synonym for primal terror, and he was older than them all. Anomalocaris, in translation, unusual shrimp, but in this name lies a bitter irony. Nearly a meter in length, he was the first super predator of our planet, a representative of the now extinct class of dinocarids. A giant by the standards of the Cambrian period, yet even his greatness did not protect him from the inexorable march of time. By the end of the Cambrian, Anomalocaris vanished, unable to endure either the climatic changes or the onslaught of new, more advanced competitors. Life continued on its path, and ahead of it lay a trial whose equal the history of the whole planet had not known. The Great Permian extinction became the final chord of the Paleozoic era, a catastrophe of planetary scale, an apocalypse that erased from the face of the earth percent of all inhabitants of the ocean. Percent of land species sank into oblivion. The giant insects and titanic arthropods, who had ruled the world for millions of years, vanished almost entirely. This was the point of no return. The world emptied, but precisely in this emptiness, in the silence of a scorched planet, lay the seed of all the future. Please write in the comments how this story struck you. It really matters to me to understand whether this world, in which you and I would never have survived, caught hold of you. What do you think? Did Arthropleura leave because the age of giants had exhausted itself? Or did she have a chance to adapt to a dry world? Had the changes come more slowly?